Zaretta Hammond is a national consultant and author of Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, promoting authentic engagement and rigor for culturally and linguistically diverse students. She is a former high school and community college expository writing instructor, and for the past 20 years, she has supported schools and other institutions in deepening their understanding and application of culturally responsive practices. She currently runs the Culturally Responsive Education by Design Online, PLC, which is a 6-month intensive inquiry-based professional learning experience to build instructional capacity to use culturally responsive tools and practices effectively. Ms. Hammond is a strong literacy advocate who sits on the board of trustees for the Center for the Collaborative Classroom. She is also a member of the advisory board for the Consortium for Reading Education, or CORE. I would like to warmly welcome Zaretta Hammond to the Specialist Series today. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Well, first, we love a backstory on the International Curriculum Specialist Series, so we want to know where your expertise and wisdom came from. Could you tell me how you started on your journey in education and beyond?
Yeah, there's so many points of insight. I think one of the turning points for me was as a middle school student. In those middle grades, you start to gravitate toward interest, and one of my interests was science. I had a wonderful teacher who taught environmental science in San Francisco, California, and I just fell in love with it. But I soon got the message that because of my gender, because of my color, I was not expected to excel or to have the ability to really understand what was going on, that this was over my head, and was, constantly being pigeonholed into less exciting courses, less rigorous courses. And I just really became aware of that marginalization. And so really, as I went through my own schooling and started to pursue education as a profession, I did so with the intent that no other girl, particularly a girl of color, would have to feel that way, that STEM education was not for her, or because you were a Black person, you could not understand science or math. And that has just been the ethos of my, journey as an educator, to make sure that all students have the opportunity to reach their fullest intellectual potential, no matter what their background, no matter what their race, ethnicity, or mother tongue.
Well, it sounds like your background definitely shaped the book that you wrote and the work that you do. And on that note, how would you define culturally responsive teaching? What is it and what is it not?
I think that's a great question, because a lot of people are talking about culturally responsive teaching, culturally sustaining and responsive practices. There are a lot of variations out there, culturally relevant pedagogy. But here's the thing I think that is important across all of those, that it's not just the culture part. We want to affirm students' cultural identities, but it's the responsive part. They come in with funds of knowledge, they come in with experience, they come in as eager and intellectually curious learners. How do we leverage that so that we can respond to them in ways that leverage those funds of knowledge, that are culturally congruent in a way that signals to the brain, this is a safe space. You have intellectual safety here. It's okay to fail. Nobody's going to say that's because you're Black or because you're a girl. You have a sense of belonging. And so I think that's one of the pieces we miss in terms of kind of really understanding the responsive part. Then we just make it sometimes about relationships, when the responsive part is also, how do we create cognitive hooks between the known funds of knowledge and background knowledge a student brings and the new content. The science of learning tells us that all new learning must be coupled with old learning and mixed together to get to that understanding. And so we can't ignore what students bring. We can't trivialize it. We can't act as if it doesn't exist or it's less than knowledge than book learning. So culturally responsive teaching is really a way to make sure that we can center students and affirm, validate, and use the knowledge that they bring into the classroom. What it's not a program or approach that's about motivation, right? A lot of people will talk about, oh, we're trying to motivate students. It's really not about doing that. So being able to help people understand this is not about, trying to get kids excited about learning by, putting random mentions of, something from their racial or linguistic or ethnic background in there. The other thing it's not is just purely a curriculum change to have more diverse books or to have social justice topics. I see that a lot, right? We still don't focus on the student taking inert information and turning it into usable knowledge. Instead, we just focus on, you'll be more motivated if I show you more brown faces in a book. And that's kind of, the lowest common denominator. But it does not attend to the responsive part of that phrase, culturally responsive teaching.
Yeah, and thank you for really clarifying that, because I think that is something that, looking at our teaching and what we do, it's a great thing to ask of how culturally responsive we are in the classroom and what we do as educators. So it's great to hear, that definition of clarifying that. So you state in your book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, quote, "Too often we think of a student's academic mindset as a personal choice or an expression of the family's valuing of education. In reality, schools do a lot more to influence a negative academic mindset than we'd like to admit." Now, this was a powerful phrase when I read this in your book, what you said. And what would you say to schools? What do you say that schools do to create a negative academic mindset, especially for the students?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is being willing to look with new eyes at what current reality is. Because most of us do not go into education to send a negative message or to give students a negative experience of school. Just the opposite. We want them to fall in love with learning like we fell in love with learning. That's why most of us are educators, right? But what we do know is schools can be systems of reproduction of the larger stratifications, caste systems, and structures in the larger society. So we do see schools doing kind of a sorting thing. And when it does that, when it functions in that way, and a lot of times it's invisible. This is not just people behaving badly, as a lot of these things are embedded invisibly into our ways of doing school. And what happens is the messaging to students, the opportunities they get to be stretched, to be interested. So they are sent this message through the fact that they may have a classroom that is more about being orderly, be quiet, sit in your place, you'll get points for that orderliness, versus getting points for your intellectual curiosity. And so as students kind of go through the grades, they start to get this subtle messaging of feeling like they don't belong, or I see a kid who might be white or coming from a higher class, getting a different type of education, and here I am still struggling. So after a while, kids aren't blind to the disparities that they see in front of them. And it's in these messages that the mindset starts to get communicated to the student. So sometimes it's the subtle things we do say from the front of the room, but more importantly, it's the kind of environment that we create where students don't feel it is helping them grow intellectually or feeding their intellectual curiosity.
You also write about establishing alliances in learning partnerships and becoming a warm demander. How should teachers best establish that alliance with their students? And what exactly is a warm demander?
Well, the term warm demander has been in the literature for a while, and probably I'd say 2 decades at least. And the idea is that there is a way in which we can bring personal warmth to our relationships with students, but that's not enough to get students to kind of level up their learning, and that we need the demanding part of that. And a lot of people think, oh, that's being strict and that's being, kind of forcing students to be obedient, and that's not what that means. The warm demander, the demander part, is about active demandingness. Some people talk about it as warm strict, but that is a binary misnomer. The demanding is very much like what a coach demands of you, right? The coach is not there to beat you up, right? Or a personal trainer is not there to beat you up. They're actually there to stretch you into your zone of proximal development. So what you can't do on your own, because you trust them, they're going to take you into this space where you can stretch and grow. So same thing that happens in our physical development. If we get a personal trainer, the same thing happens when the teacher acts as a coach for the student's cognition. So the warm demander is really thinking about helping the student level up their learning, right? And it's a nice mix of care and push. And that comes from having that relationship. So the relationship by itself is not enough. And that's why I talk to folks about those learning partnerships. In the alliance, right, we're together, we look at each other, teacher and student, and we say, we're going to make sure that you can learn how your long vowels work. And in the next 3 weeks, we're going to make sure that you know 40 of the 44 phonemes that are, connected to the sound spelling, right? It's that kind of precise. And now we're up to something together. So that alliance is not just something that I just blanketly throw out to the whole class. It's that the teacher having relationships with students and knowing how to cultivate that care and push so that the student can stretch himself into that zone of proximal development. Now, the development of that for a teacher takes time. You just can't come in and demand it. When students feel you know them, you care about them, that personal warmth, then they give you permission to push them. And it's a really, really powerful thing. And having meetings with them, like, what are you up to, right? Talking about their learning moves. So this is what I write about in the book, that culturally responsive teaching is about liberatory education, helping every student become a powerful learner, not because we pronounce it, but like personal trainers of their cognition, we teach them how to grow their own brain power.
So in the International Middle Years Curriculum, or what we call the IMYC, we are turning to experts much like yourself to help look at some of the learning goals we devised for health and well-being. So in the strand of brain and metacognition, we want students to know how stress can be an inhibitor to learning. And we also have identified key needs of the teenage brain. And the IMYC is designed to support and improve learning throughout the middle years. So with your work and research, Zaretta, you have accomplished some excellent work in regard to those areas. So first, can you tell us about the brain's safety threat system and why teachers, along with students, should know how it works?
Yes, so here's the kind of the quick version of how that works is we have 3 parts to our nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, this is our amygdala, little almond-shaped sized part of our brain that really has a lot of control because it's on the scan constantly for threat. And it will increase our stress hormones and adrenaline so that we can kind of be ready to get out of a place that feels unsafe. Now, what's important to understand about that is the brain detects physical threat, possible bodily harm, something like that. But it also detects social threat, threat to one's sense of well-being, one's sense of self. No one wants to be shamed or humiliated. So if there's circumstances that feel like I'm going to be in this environment and shamed and humiliated, I don't want to be here. This is why it's one of the things that's really important in terms of being culturally responsive is making sure that we are creating classrooms that are free of microaggressions and racial bullying. Because those aren't jokes, but a lot of children will like, oh, I just said that as a joke. And we just kind of like, oh, okay, when it really isn't. Because what it does is it hijacks the amygdala and then no learning can go on. So there are a variety of things that we need to understand about that. But here's what's really important about that safety threat system is that stress part is not the only part, right? The parts also around how we feel connected, right? The vagus nerve and the polyvagal strands of that come out of our brainstem and go into our stomach help us feel connected. So you have to actually balance those two. It's not enough to say, oh, let's just reduce stress without saying, how are we increasing oxytocin? So those two things need to go together. Then you have the part of the system that contributes to our well-being, that is the part of our brain that gives us dopamine. So part of what we want to be able to do is hard things, right? This is about moving the student into that zone of proximal development or stretching them. When we can do that with a sense of belonging in a community of learners, and when we can do hard things, our brain rewards us with dopamine. And that means when we get a dopamine hit, we want to do that thing so we can get that dopamine hit again. It is the warmest, sticky, yummiest thing our brain could feed on. So it wants that. So whatever we did to get that, we'll do it again. So the teacher's ability to understand how these three parts work in that wellness is important. It's not enough just to reduce cortisol or tell students about stress. It's also about telling them about dopamine and helping them understand what are the things that are going to increase oxytocin so that they don't increase it for themselves, but they do the things that will increase it for others. And as they're doing that for others, others are doing it for them. That's actually how human beings generate oxytocin, right? And it becomes really important in terms of that safety threat system that we have. If we want the brain to be calm and ready in a state of relaxed alertness, we don't want it to sleep. So we don't want to reduce all stress. All stress isn't bad. We just don't want to overload that stress that is not mixed in a nice cocktail with oxytocin and dopamine.
And going further with the brain and adding to the brain's safety threat system, you've also identified 6 brain rules in your book, The Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. Can you tell me, what are those 6 brain rules?
Yeah, I really, probably a decade ago, there was a book titled Brain Rules, and I read it. I'm in love with neuroscience, social neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience. And as I was writing this book, I'm like, oh, okay, we need to understand the brain rules for helping students kind of grow their capacity and how that intersects with our efforts around equity and liberatory education for historically marginalized students and families. And so that's how I kind of devised these to really help educators kind of like hang on to some of this information that might feel like, oh, that's too technical or it's too academic. I didn't want to feel that way. It's like, just remember these rules, right? So the first one is what we were talking about earlier, that the brain seeks to minimize threats and maximize opportunities to connect with others in community. So that's the oxytocin, right? And the dopamine. We will seek out other people. So when we think about learning environments, what's really important about that one is we need to create a container, right? That intellectual safety, that it has a sense of community and connection. Here's what I'll say about the most important element there is not because the teacher pronounces it, but because there are structures, rituals, and routines that communicate to the brain silently that this is actually true. because the brain doesn't listen to what we say. It assesses the conditions around it. It looks at the nonverbals and the visuals before it actually listens to the words. And then it says, do the words match what's actually going on around me, right? The brain does not like gaslighting. So it's going to refuse to believe, you say I'm welcome, but I don't feel this way. And this person's over here racially harassing me. And so the brain goes with what it is experiencing rather than what you're saying. So it's really important for us to understand brain wants to seek out community. And that means when it seeks it out, it better find it. Otherwise, it will revert back and not engage. So we have this kind of disengagement of students, and that's connected to that academic mindset. We want kids to feel engaged. We want them to feel a sense of belonging. Then you have to create these nonverbal, visual cues and structures and routines and rituals that communicate that to the brain. So that's why that's the very first one. Second one, positive relationships keep our safety threat detection system in check. So again, this is back to that sense of belonging. Relationships are important. What's important about relationships? Again, it's not because we pronounce it, but because of the small gestures that build trust. So in culturally responsive teaching the brain, I talk about trust generators. What do we do that communicates to our brain that I can trust that person? So there are 6 things out of, neuroscience that we know increase a sense of attachment and connection with other people. Sometimes it's proximity. You go to the local coffee shop and you see that barista all the time, and after a while you think you know them, and you might exchange bits of information about each other's lives, and those small gestures build trust with other humans, right? And so again, this is that personal warmth. That's the dimension of the warm demander, right? Personal warmth plus active demandingness. So understanding that you want to start to know the student. I talk about kid watching. Just collect a little information about each student, be able to follow up with the student. And it starts by just knowing the student's name, pronouncing the name properly, right? Asking a follow-up question about something that happened 2 weeks ago. Oh, I heard your mom was going to have a baby. Did the baby come? I didn't hear anything about it. How's that happen? Did you win the baseball game? And what we know about the brain is the lights up and it secretes oxytocin. So we have these little pings of bonding. Really, really important. The third one is culture guides how we process information. One of the things that I found when people were talking about culturally responsive teaching is they didn't talk about the instructional side, the cognitive side, right? We do it because we know historically we've had marginalization, we've had segregation, we've had schools that didn't welcome certain types of students because of their race or their ethnicity or their language, first language. So part of what we're having to do is make sure we are understanding the role culture plays. And sometimes we have, like I said at the top of our talk, that we misunderstand the culture part. And here, culture is what we consider schema, right? This is what we also call in education background knowledge. And I talk in one of the chapters in helping people really understand how the brain uses culture to sort and organize information in our head, and therefore how we're going to take that in, how we're going to process it, how we're going to connect it to other things we know is going to be culturally derived. And so this is really important, not necessarily racially derived, but whatever the culture is, right? Collectivist versus individualist. It's not even versus, right? That's a continuum. We're at one side of the continuum or we're at other. Most of us are somewhere in the middle, right? In terms of how we were socialized from 0 to 7. So it becomes important just to kind of understand that socialization in the kind of the cultural terms. And what those cultural norms are. What's the deep culture? What's the shallow culture? Shallow culture, the unspoken or unwritten rules of engagement, how close we stand, who talks first, can we talk over each other, is that okay? What are the signs of love? What are the signs of not being responsive and disconnection? For example, in some cultures, waiting till someone finishes talking, being more silent or quiet is considered, respectful. And in other cultures, it's considered as a sign of you're not engaged and you're not connecting with me. So knowing kind of the cultural ways that the brain processes information and makes meaning of these things, that looking at the same thing, we are coming away with different interpretations of a similar event, is because of processing through culture. All right, so that was 3. We've got 2 more. Attention drives learning. I love this one. I don't think it gets enough discussion, because what it really means is getting the brain to pay attention is the first step in processing information and comprehension. A lot of times we want to jump right into, well, let's help students learn comprehension or to be rigorous. But first, we have to have intellectual curiosity. We have to get the brain to pay attention, not because we set it from the front of the room, but because the brain turns its attention to that thing in front of it. Then it can actually start to move through a set of processes that we call elaboration. I talk about it as chewing, right? Taking the known and connecting it with the unknown and chewing on it, making sense of it, making meaning of it. But first you have to get a brain's attention. So sometimes students can fake us out, right? They're looking at us, but they're really not paying attention. So being able to get that is important. Number 5, all new information must be coupled with existing funds of knowledge. And I've talked about this before, that we can't get students to understanding until they can take the new content, make meaning, and connect it to the things that they already know. And you can't do that for them as the teacher, right? You cannot kind of like birds do, mama birds chews the food and then puts it in the baby bird's mouth, right? That actually leads to the deceleration of students' cognitive growth. You're actually harming them. It's like carrying around a child who is, a year old, and every time they look like they want to walk, you come and grab them up. They will not build the muscle. Same thing goes with our brain. So being able to have students do that kind of productive struggle, right, mixing the two, is the kind of environment we actually have to create. And 6, final, certainly not least, the brain physically grows through challenge and stretch, extending its ability to do more complex thinking and learning. So again, 4, 5, and 6 are all connected to that information processing. The more the student can engage in productive struggle without emotional distress, the more the student actually will grow dendrites or cognitive structures, and the more those neural pathways, the more they can take on more rigorous content. The challenge is we just throw rigorous content at students, and we don't help them actually build the kind of cognitive capacity that allows them to do something with that. So now that's where the vicious cycle sets in. If you give them more rigorous stuff and they just keep failing, then they're going to start to internalize that as, I'm just a failure. I'm stupid. I can't do that. So understanding that personal training of students' cognition, then how do we actually help the student to do that? So being able to help students move their brains to that physical productive struggle, literally taking things apart. So this is why maker spaces are really powerful. Having students solve a real challenge or a problem. There have to be at least 2 things they're rubbing together. And the rubbing together in a way that doesn't take them into, frustration, but also is not so low level that they could, do it with their eyes closed. The brain doesn't have to pay attention. But that sweet spot, right? The zone of proximal development is where in community they're laughing, they're challenged, they're doing hard things, but it's feeling kind of good, right? That's a sweet spot. But here's the thing I'll say coming out of talking about these 6 things. We have to create the spaces and reorganize and rethink time use, structures for talking, different types of talking, really important. So sometimes we just think, oh, we'll have kids turn and talk, or we'll just do this fun activity. But there are no routines and structures in the classroom that allow this kind of productive struggle to be a regular part of their daily learning life, and particularly for our most dependent learners. We have a tendency to have a pedagogy of compliance rather than a pedagogy of complex thinking, intellectual curiosity.
Those are fantastic. And I think coming from that is also going back to our question about that negative mindset and what creates that. And if we don't set that space, hearing from you and creating those relationships, then no matter what you throw, you're going to have, if you don't have that connection and that environment and those routines, as you mentioned, you're not going to fly.
Yeah. Here's what I would say to that. That's right. Here's what I would say, how I would extend that or maybe tweak the statement you make is not relationships by themselves. So again, if I don't actually take students through an apprenticeship, an apprenticeship is not a relationship. So the relationship is a means to an end. Right? So I have to have a relationship, but if I just have a relationship, but I don't have any opportunity for productive struggle, I don't apprentice them into it, I don't help them manage their mindset. These are things that happen because we have a community of learners, and I can scaffold students through that. This is why when we focus on well-being and the keeping the brain and the emotions balanced, that next piece of relationships is so that we can help students engage in productive struggle. So you have to start talking about relationships for the purpose of productive struggle. Just to say relationships is going to continue to favor students who already have skills of productive struggle, and it's going to disadvantage and continue to marginalize historically marginalized students around race and language that don't have those skills around productive struggle, because that is the institutionalized way that colonization has reinforced that kind of sorting. So it sounds kind of really powerful and wonderful for us to say relationships, but relationships without coaching students or bringing students into the power of productive struggle that feels calm and engaging and fun has to be the purpose behind why we would invest in relationships. So we have to say those all, it's a mouthful, yeah, but the reality is relationships by themselves don't lead to rigor. And we don't want to oversell that.
Correct, yeah. Zaretta, you have said so many great things. You've given great highlights from your book, and I really appreciate your time. So we always like to end on a takeaway. And if there's anything, is there one takeaway you would like the listeners and the viewers to know about culturally responsive teaching or the brain, along with any of your working experience? What would it be?
Yeah, I think the conversation we've been having about becoming a warm demander of students' cognition, think of yourself as that personal trainer of students' cognition, and to take that away as the core of culturally responsive teaching, not just having diversified curriculum. Because if the students don't have real learning skills, you can put information or curriculum in front of them, and it doesn't mean that they can carry more of the cognitive load. So really expanding our interpretation of what culturally responsive is and not limiting it to just the relational domain, but to understand that there is an emotional and relational aspect of instruction as well.
Fantastic. I've learned so much in these last minutes, or this 30 minutes, half an hour or so with you, and I really appreciate the book that you've made, and what a difference it makes with thinking about how we can become these warm demanders and how we build learning partnerships and how we can be culturally responsive in the classroom. So I really want to thank you for all your insights today.
You are so welcome. I'm looking forward to, having new readers pick up the book and join our growing community of educators around the world and in really, advocating for liberatory education.
Please check out Zaretta Hammond's excellent book online, at your local bookshop, or wherever you buy or listen to your books. For more resources and information on how to be a part of her virtual professional learning community, Culturally Responsive Education by Design, visit www.crebydesign.com. And you can also join Zaretta's monthly newsletter at www.crtandthebrain.com. Thanks again, Zaretta. I appreciate it.
You are so welcome.